Welcome to the Ralston College podcast. I'm Stephen Blackwood. It's been my profound pleasure to share with you over the past several weeks Dr. Iain McGilchrist's stirring series of talks on wholeness, imagination, and the cosmos, which he delivered here at Ralston College last year for our annual Sophia Lectures. In attendance at those lectures was a group of 24 extraordinary students enrolled in our intensive one-year MA in the Humanities program. During Dr. McGhilchrist's visit, these students had the opportunity to interact closely with him during shared meals and small seminars, evening poetry readings. He was, after all, living next door. As well as, finally, an afternoon where we simply gathered to give them a chance to ask him questions. And it's that conversation that I have the pleasure of sharing with you today, the last of a series of episodes featuring highlights from Dr. McGhilchrist's visit to Ralston College. The breadth and depth of our students' questions reveal the range of their backgrounds and interests, as well as the rigor and authenticity with which they grappled with the ideas and themes presented in Dr. McGhilchrist's lectures. And their questions allowed Dr. McGhilchrist to further elaborate on those themes and ideas with his characteristic warmth and erudition. I'm delighted now to be able to share that conversation with you, which shows both Dr. McGhilchrist's remarkable mind and the vibrant community here at Ralston College. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Thanks for listening. Good morning and welcome, everyone. It's great to see you all this sort of rainy and cozy Friday morning for what I know is going to be a very lively discussion with Dr. Iain McGilchrist. The format here really is meant to be that of a Q&A, and so we're just going to dive right into it. A couple of notes. First, I think in terms of the topical range, I think really you can consider that very open. Of course, you were all at Dr. McGhilchrist's wonderful series of 3 Sophia lectures last week. And so I think certainly feel very free to engage any of those, the themes, arguments, ideas of any of those 3 lectures, either in the staged argument that they went through or as a whole. I think I'm not out of line to say that Dr. McGhilchrist would be happy to answer questions on any other aspect of his work, or indeed perhaps his reflections on education or our time in our culture and history, and all of these things that I know are very much at the heart of his work, but also very much at the heart of the questions that this college is intended to ask.
I'm happy to fail to answer questions on almost any topic.
That's right. Iain, it's just been such an enormous privilege and pleasure for us to have you here at Ralston College, and thank you for coming back.
Oh, I'm thoroughly delighted to be here. I already feel very much at home. And I was just saying, as I said last night, Floreat Ralstonia. I think you should have a little thing on a Thursday night where somebody proposes Floreat Ralstonia, and then the entire body say, Floreat! But that's my general sentiment in 2 words.
Well, thank you. Any questions? Yes. Oh, right out of the gate. Okay, we'll start with Adam and then Danny. Thank you. Pass down to Adam.
So I know it would be an oversimplification to view the lateralization of the brain as right brain good, left brain bad.
Oh, God, yes.
So, I have understood that, if nothing else.
Yeah.
So, in light of that, I was thinking about religious imagery and the importance of being on the right hand of Christ in the judgment, as we heard about from Pajot.
Yes.
And essentially, I was wondering, if the right hand is the right place to be, that's associated with the left brain, and something like order or being accounted for, grabbed, and I was wondering if that has, that more positive side of the left brain. Do you think that has anything related to archetypal masculinity and femininity in terms of the right brain potentially being more feminine oriented towards chaos or apprehending the whole world. And then the left brain is this sort of archetypally masculine, order-bringing, you phrased it as grabbing before. Is that a reasonable way of viewing what is good about the left hemisphere?
Right. Well, there's several things in that question. Thank you very much. I think, let me come back to what is good about the left hemisphere. But what you're describing, first of all, I think you may know, I don't know, but I hope you do, that I don't accept that the right hemisphere is sort of feminine and the left hemisphere masculine. I think that's a gross simplification. And unfortunately, for those who want to make that case, all the actual physiology and indeed even anatomy actually suggests otherwise. Perhaps I should just address that very briefly. I think at some point in the first, probably in the 300s in The Matter with Things, I do examine the evidence, and the point is this, that testosterone causes the right hemisphere to enlarge during the second trimester of pregnancy. And I say that the right hemisphere is bigger and heavier than the left, and this is largely due to aggregating male and female brains. In that the male brain is more like that. And there's about 20 other things I could say, and none of them really point in the direction that you're indicating. For example, one of the more robust findings in psychology is that women have an advantage in verbal expression, which of course is not purely left hemisphere, but points in the direction of the left hemisphere, which is for most of us the one that underlies speech. And visuospatial orientation, which is a strongly right hemisphere thing, is more marked in men. So it's a very complicated story. I just wanted to say that. I don't really want to dive any further into it. But if those who are interested can find a disquisition on this in part 1 of The Matter with Things. Coming on to the use of the idea of the right hand, well, in the West, as you know, there is an association, understandable one, between the right hand and good, because this is the one that enables us to express ourselves in the world, impress ourselves on the world. And as a result of that, of course, we have the idea that the left hemisphere is sinister. I mean, literally, that is the Latin for the left. And this is a fairly marked thing since I think about the 3rd century AD, but I'm very reluctant to say anything in the presence of David Butterfield about this. But I believe, and I think I write about this in a footnote in The Master and His Emissary, that at a certain earlier point, the left hand was considered to be propitious, and it has an association with creativity. And that's interesting because in traditional Chinese culture, the left hand is wiser and more expressive. And I noticed that in the Renaissance, there was a sudden interest in the left hand as being apparently, although not anatomically, literally, closer to the heart, whatever that means. They thought, in fact, that there was a vascular supply to the left arm from the heart that was different or more elaborate. But I don't think there's the slightest evidence of that. But nonetheless, obviously, people got the idea that something to do with the left side was special, mystical, associated with religion and with love, and was honorable. Now let me take the point about what is good about the left hemisphere. Virtually everything about it is good as long as it understands, which it doesn't, that there are limits to what it can know. So precisely because it's not concerned with the big picture, it doesn't really know what it is it's dealing with. It's as though a high-functioning bureaucrat were given the necessary information and asked to do certain procedures, elaborate it, and so on, and report back. Unfortunately, it doesn't report back because it thinks, having elaborated it, it understands it, but it doesn't really understand it. The true understanding comes from the right hemisphere when it has been able to reintegrate what it already knows at a more intuitive level with what the analysis that's affected by the left hemisphere can offer. So on the front page of my channel McGhilchrist, there is a quote which I didn't choose actually, but somebody found it from somewhere I'd written, that our capacity to analyze and so on is an unbelievably powerful gift, and it's only second to our capacity to integrate and see the whole. And that's a good way of putting it. In other words, it's a very good emissary, but not a good master. And reportedly, Einstein said something almost exactly like that, which I didn't know actually when I was writing the book, that reason is a faithful servant, and the intuition is a precious gift. We live in a world in which we honor the servant but have forgotten the gift. And we know from his work and his writings and from all the conversations that were had with him about the way he came to his conclusions, that they were primarily intuitive and only later worked out rather painstakingly in detail. And in fact, Einstein's gifts were very much more of the Gestalt vision, the aha moment, the intuitive, than the laboriously linear.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Over to Danny, a question.
I wonder if you could say something about, you made a statement that you said matter is a phase of consciousness, and then you said that materialists are in fact people who undervalue matter because matter is actually the potential for all things. That's what Aristotle says when he speaks about prime matter. I just wondered if you could say more about matter as a phase of consciousness.
Thank you. It's a good question. Effectively, if you are a reductive materialist, by which I mean you imagine that material has nothing whatever to do with consciousness, but consciousness somehow pops out of matter at a later stage. First of all, that's a little bit of a miracle. But actually, that if lumpen matter randomly bumping into other parts of lumpen matter around the universe can give rise to Bach St. Matthew Passion, that matter is pretty remarkable stuff. And so even starting from basics, I think that is right. In the chapter on matter and consciousness, chapter 25 in The Matter with Things, I talk about the possible relationships between matter and consciousness, looking at the various theories about how brain takes part in this process. And roughly speaking, I say that there are three possibilities. Either the brain emits consciousness, or it transmits consciousness, or it permits consciousness, which is a variation on transmission. Both of those suggest that consciousness has not originated in the brain. There's enough evidence that consciousness may exist when the brain is not properly functioning at all, to suggest that consciousness is not in itself reliant on the brain, but it's not really that. It's that I believe that matter and consciousness, matter must have something of consciousness in it. And in this I am, alas, in the mainstream for once. Now in philosophy there is a strong tendency to something called panpsychism, the view that psyche is in everything. And I'd think of it in a different way from the way in which it's often put out there. So somebody like Richard Dawkins says, what, you think this chair has consciousness as I do? Well, I don't think anyone thinks that. It's a very good question, though. If you don't think that, what kind of a consciousness are you actually talking about? I think that's a robust question. And instead, I turn it the other way around and suggest that consciousness is the basis of everything. It is the ontological primitive, behind which and beyond which you cannot go. And this is a perfectly coherent position. It's also one that has been espoused by many traditions around the world for a very long time. And in that, the question arises, why should there be matter? And we can go into a lot about that, but perhaps to keep things moving, I won't go into that particular question, but instead answer it the way that I would answer it, which is that I believe matter is a phase, as you say, of consciousness, by which, of course, I don't mean a temporal phase. I mean it in the sense that chemists talk about the phases of substances. So the phases of water are one in which it is translucent and liquid and flows across your hand. Another is where it's opaque and immobile and incredibly hard and hard enough to split your head open. And in another, it's suspended in the atmosphere in this room, tons of it, without which we couldn't be here and breathing. Which of these is the real water? They're all really water, they're just different phases of water. So when people say, well, matter doesn't look like consciousness, I say, well, neither does ice look like water, and so forth. Water and ice and the suspension of ice in the air is almost like a trinity again of different ways of manifestation of consciousness, in that consciousness is, I believe, the origin of things, but part of the origin is that it is also the origin of matter. So nobody has ever seen matter. Nobody has ever been able to see matter. All we know that there are elements in our consciousness which have qualities we call material. And those qualities are largely due to something in our consciousness which resists our will and which also affords a degree of permanence to whatever is created. If you're creating in the cosmos, I believe the cosmos is creative, everything about it suggests that it is constantly ramifying, differentiating, complexifying, beautifying. So this is, again, hardly controversial. If there is to be that, then there needs to be a degree of something that can hold a thought for a while and can also offer some resistance. So the permanence aspect means that if there wasn't anything that gave even temporary permanence to an idea, everything would collapse in space and time into a single thought. So if the business of the cosmos is, as I believe it is, to differentiate a single union, but also to unify what is differentiated, as Goethe said, this is the whole process, at least of nature, to divide what is united and unite what is divided. I think that was a very deep and wise insight. That requires a degree of permanence seeking that material things in our consciousness can provide, but it also provides necessary resistance. The idea here being that anything that comes into being does so because there is a degree of resistance. If there was no resistance, nothing could happen. For example, I take the example of, you may have heard me say this before, friction. What is the definition of friction? It is that which opposes motion. It is also that which enables motion. Without it, I couldn't move. None of us could ever leave this room. So those are the elements, I think, in the story that I would like to draw attention to. And just to say something further about the idea that consciousness might arise out of the brain, after many decades, even hundreds of years of trying to work out how this happens, we still are no nearer to it, quite honestly. Nobody has the slightest idea how this miracle could happen. And although they use certain words and they use certain strategies, they usually boil down to, and now a miracle happens. And something completely unlike matter, not just a different emergence as the feel of water as a flowing substance emerges out of H2O molecules, but that's not an analogy for the emergence of consciousness, which is completely fundamental to our ability to talk about anything or to notice what happens when other things emerge in a much simpler way, like water out of H2O molecules. And one of the favorite things is the idea of complexity, and complexity is remarkable and does give rise to most of the phenomena that we experience. But the idea there is that it must be complexity of neurons, and there are a number of reasons why that can't be right. One is that, you may or may not know this, but 80% of the neurons in your brain are actually in the cerebellum, the ancient part of the brain at the base of the skull at the back. And the cerebellum on its own is completely incapable of consciousness. It's also possibly suggested, when that is put forward, that maybe it's because the cerebellum doesn't afford as many interconnections. That would be unlikely, because as you increase the number of neurons, you increase the potential number of connections exponentially. But it's also untrue that the neurons in the cerebellum are less elaborately processed, in the sense of having processes that touch other neurons, than the nerves in the cerebrum. And there are also examples of individuals who actually have almost literally no brain. And I say almost literally because we're familiar with the case of people who have hydrocephalus. They may have, in other words, a lot of the space that's normally taken up by the brain replaced by CSF. So it's really just a rim of cortex. And there's a case I like reported by John Lorber of a young man at Leeds University who had an IQ of 126 and had a first-class degree in mathematics and was socially normal, but had virtually no brain, actually. He just had a rim of cortex. And yet it would have only been found at autopsy normally, but for some reason he had a head scan. But more dramatic than that, there are individuals who have something similar but more dramatic, hydranencephaly. So anencephaly means having no brain, and most children that are anencephalic die at birth. But in hydranencephaly, really it stops at the brain stem. And yet they are capable, obviously not of leading a normal life, but they're capable of seeing things, although there's no visual cortex. They're capable of recognizing people, of having friends, of enjoying music, of having favorite toys, and so forth. So we don't know enough to say that consciousness arises out of the brain. And I personally think it's an irrational assumption. Sorry, it was a long answer, but it's a very good question, and that may cover ground for other people that I don't need to repeat.
Question from Jake.
So a lot of the things that you say resonate with me very deeply, as well as theologically. I think everyone in the room knows I'm a member of the Mormon Church, and these things like opposition in all things and matter being a form of intelligence more refined, like these are baked into our theology, and I find it very interesting. And yet, I'm watching as droves of people, in my generation particularly, are leaving our church, and not without good reason. I'm not saying that there are no good reasons to leave organized religion, because I think that there are, and it's a personal choice. But my question is this. There are so many religions, spiritual traditions around the world that have just fascinating metaphysical ways of viewing the world that add so much to a person's life. And yet the institutions can quickly, it seems, become so stodgy and stale. And how can we, the proverbial we as human beings, reintegrate religious community in a way that feels revitalized for our contemporary context, and so that we can gain those metaphysical roots, even if we personally are not interested in the current instantiation of the religious institution?
Thank you, Jake. And you're right to point to the fact that this is not just a local phenomenon here, but there have been points in history and other places in the world where a kind of formalization of religion has distracted people from its important essence. I will come to answer the question, what should we do? But let me just mention this. A very great rabbi, Abraham Heschel, who was a 20th century East Coast American rabbi, refers to something I didn't know about in the tradition, I think, of the Kabbalah, that there are two forces. It may not even be Kabbalistic, Halakha and Agadah. And it's extraordinary because I quote a large chunk of this, and it's just describing the differences between the two hemispheres. And there are lots of instances of this throughout history where people seem to have intuited this difference without knowing anything much about the structure of the brain. But what happens, I think, is that the initial insights are complex and beautiful and transformative and, in essence, rather mystical, and that these are foundations for being able to begin to speak about the divine, although it's an inherently paradoxical thing to try and do because all words fail when it comes to speaking about God. But nonetheless, there is this tendency to want to formalize all the time. And he says that when God gave his people bread and wine, halakha was the bread, agadah was the wine. Agadah is in essence the right hemisphere, is able to understand things that the left hemisphere would say, but that doesn't compute. But is, as it were, the repository of the spirit, whereas halakha is the repository of the law. And these tensions are very obvious in the history of Christianity at different periods, where people have overemphasized the idea of the word, that it's infallible, that there is a law, and that these laws must be followed, and if you aren't followed, you'll be damned, and so forth. So this has all the hallmarks of a right and wrong, absolute, explicit, decontextualized idea of what God should be, could be. And on the other hand, you've got this capacity, which is endowed in us in the right hemisphere, to understand things that go beyond language, that are not necessarily possible to be made explicit without loss, that need to be understood as a whole and not broken down into fragments, where nothing is absolutely true at all times and therefore rules are only provisional, and so on and so forth. So I think that's the problem. And I think that what puts people off the idea of coming to a religion like Christianity is that they're going to be asked to sign up to 8 impossible things before breakfast. And that may come in time if they're able to stay with Christianity long enough to see why those impossible ideas have any traction. So, as it were, I was immediately appealed to by the depth and, well, the unfathomable depth of the Christian mythos, by the extraordinary depth and beauty of Christian mystics, particularly Meister Eckhart, the poets of the 17th century, Donne and Herbert, Traherne and Vaughan, for example, the wonderful music of polyphony in the Renaissance. All these things spoke to me directly of the divine. They didn't speak to me emotionally. They did that. They didn't speak to me just intellectually. They did that. But they spoke to me undoubtedly spiritually. And it's just not encompassable by the idea of intellect and emotions. So that is a very good way to start. And for example, the Trinity, which I think is actually a very rich and important, unfathomably rich idea, I used to think was completely dotted. Don't ask me to believe in this man, the boy, and the bird. I mean, it's just this ridiculous. And now I really understand that this is a very powerful idea about the Renaissance. First of all, the relational nature of God. Secondly, the idea that God is transcendent, is equally immanent, and is in each of us, although that doesn't exhaust the divine by any means. It's a gift. So understanding that is wonderful, and you find it in Rumi, and you find it in pre-Christian West, the idea of the Trinity. So what I'm saying there is intellectual ideas can come at a certain stage, but if you put them up front and ask people to subscribe to them, you'll turn them away. So there are many problems with our response to people are leaving something. They are leaving the church is one of the really classic ones. And so exactly the wrong thing has been assumed, that religion is too other, it's too remote from daily life. So let's make it all very cozy and all let's just chat in an informal way, and the vicar will come in on a motorbike and play the guitar. and it's very similar to life at home. But people are going there for something different from what they get at home. And crikey, I'd like to bang a lot of clerics' heads together over this because they're missing a trick. I mean, lately, I think it's sacrilegious, actually. They held a disco in Canterbury Cathedral. That won't convince anybody who's not already a convinced Christian, but it might really make a convinced Christian think again about what the church is up to. No, they should be going in the other direction, very definitely. And I sometimes say that what the church should do would be to set up communities, religious communities, small ones, in big cities, and have them say the offices and possibly sing, and open their doors to people simply to curiously come in and see what is happening, to put down their shopping and notice that something numinous is in this room that they can't completely understand. And that will be the lure with which God can pull them in, but not by beating them over the head with rules and improbable concepts.
Professor Headley.
Thank you very much, Iain. If I may just drag us back to the 17th century, I was reminded of Henry Moore when you were talking about the problem of consciousness, who talks about the relationship of matter to spirit as one of spicitude, of matter as the thickening of spirit.
That's lovely. Yes.
But staying in the 17th century, I sometimes think of you as a sort of modern-day Pascal, although rather paradoxically. And I don't mean the Pascal of the wager. I mean the Pascal of the heart.
Yes.
And his critique of the l'esprit de géométrie, and his use of this. I say this paradoxically, of course, because you're paradigmatically the philosopher of the brain. Yet Pascal's profound philosophy of the heart, which has very deep roots in St. Augustine and the whole tradition of the Philosophia Cordis, where the heart, of course, is representing, well, I think in many respects, the sort of rationality that you are pleading for, which is not the narrow rationality of the reductive kind that Pascal is criticizing, but one that actually includes the whole human being.
Yes, thank you very much. A couple of things occur to me. One is that the heart. I think somewhere in The Master and His Emissary, I quote Lear saying, "What is the cause in nature of such hard hearts?" And I say probably a deficit in the right ventromedial frontal cortex, which is what psychopaths have. I'm not suggesting that Goneril and Regan are psychopathic, but I think the terminology was the terminology for expressing something that wasn't just a rational intellect. However, of course, as an aside, I don't know what the heart may be capable of. And certainly in Eastern traditions, people claim that there are certain chakras and so on that go down the center of the body and include the heart. And when I was in medical school, we talked about the innervation of the heart, and there are nerves that go from the brain to the heart, so-called efferent nerves. And that was obviously important because the brain told the heart what to do. But there were just as many neurons that went back from the heart to the brain, so-called afferent neurons, and they were a terrific embarrassment. What they were there for, the brain didn't need to know anything from the heart, except perhaps that it was in trouble, so pain fibers. But there's much more than pain fibers there. And there is a measurable electromagnetic field around the heart. I just throw that in for interest. But thank you for the, I'd love to think there was anything in it, the comparison with the great Pascal. But I do have a version, do you know, of Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager, of course, was if there isn't a God, it's at least good to behave as though there is a God. It will do no harm and may do some good. But if there isn't a God, and you don't believe in that God, then this is having taken the wrong arm of this wager. And so the best way to handle this is to believe in God. But there's McGhilchrist wager, which has the first two, but adds a third, which is maybe we and God co-create. I mean, one of the reasons for creating such sophisticated conscious beings is that we can respond to God, and through our response, we can help to further the unlocking of, unfolding of, the explication of the implicit nature of God, and that in doing so, we actually take part in creation. And this is in keeping with, again, the Kabbalistic tradition that claims that man has a special role in being able to respond to God and repair some of the fallen world. So I just mentioned that. But thank you.
Anna.
When you came for the Sophia lectures, President Blackwood had the, I think, unenviable task of introducing you 3 separate nights in a row to an audience that was a mixture of people that were there for the first time and who had heard his introduction the night before. And I've been thinking a fair amount about this, that I don't know how I would have approached that task. If I would have just said, well, people are just going to have to suffer through it again. The biography, I mean. But I mean, you did an elegant job. No. I don't know if you remember, but President Blackwood, they were distinct, and yet they still said something about you. It was really elegant. And I think about how life, as long as we have breath, life will confront us with tasks, right? He had this task or decisions. Like we have May 19th is coming for all of us. And I asked you sort of a version of this question the other morning at breakfast, or maybe it was at lunch, but I liked your answer so well. I wonder if I'd love to hear you riff on it again in the company of my colleagues. The question is this: is there a left hemisphere way to approach a posture, a left hemisphere posture in front of life's tasks and questions, and a right hemisphere posture in front of it? And what would be the marks of each of those?
When confronted with a left hemisphere.
Like with a question, like what will I do after graduation? Or how will I approach giving this introduction?
Yes, yes. Well, first of all, I'd like to say I share your admiration for the way that Dr. Blackwood introduced me 3 times and didn't really repeat himself. So thank you very much. But my only comment is that you were overkind and generous, but thank you anyway. Yeah. Well, my response to the question, what am I going to do after this, is not to worry about it too much. It's an over-instrumentalizing question. What is the use of what you're doing here? And one doesn't know what the use of it is. If one thinks one does, one's probably misunderstood what's going on. Because it's part of allowing the potential that is in you to be drawn out. And I feel very strongly about this as a matter of education, that it is absolutely not about putting things in. It's not about inserting information or even inserting techniques for dealing with the world intellectually, but it is for drawing out things that are latent in you and allowing them to unfold, to be tested, to be discussed, to be open to criticism, of course, but also to allow you to understand at a deeper level what it is that your intuitions are telling you. So to say, what are you going to do after this? I think there are 2 problems with it. One is the suggestion that this will lead you to a certain place that you can now determine. But the other is that my experience is that it's better to turn with what life brings to you. I had no conception, which may be all too apparent from my rather haphazard career. I had no conception of exactly where I was going to go, but every time I've changed, as it were, away from philosophy to literature, away from literature to medicine, into the brain and so on, I was following something that made sense to me. And in retrospect, of course, it's easy to see why things make sense because that's the path that led you there. But also, I think genuinely it does make sense. I can now understand why I had periods. And in my case, this was a really dreadful thing because I was given this fellowship at All Souls, which allowed me to do anything I liked for 7 years, and nobody breathed down my neck. Once a year, the warden would write me a letter and ask me to say on one side of a sheet of paper what I'd done. And it was mostly reading books. And at the end of it, and when I went into medicine, I thought, good heavens, I've just squandered the greatest gift I could have been given. I will never have the freedom to spend time again like this. But I don't think a minute of it was wasted because it was then that I explored the various strands that I needed to bring together to synthesize my work. So if it has value, a lot of its value depends on something that was absolutely not focused towards a goal, although, not in the left hemisphere sense, although I've always felt called to from in front. And I make a big distinction from the idea of being propelled from behind and being called from in front. And you might say, well, having a fixed goal is calling you from the front. It is, but it then tells you that there are steps you must take, and therefore you become more mechanical. Whereas if there is a shape, a value, a telos, that just calls you to move towards it wherever it's going, then it asks you to take those steps in faith. And I think that's what I would recommend to you, is not to close down your options too quickly. I think there's no chance that you will, being the bright people that you are, that you will end up on the streets if you don't get yourself a well-paid job. Of course, we all have to keep body and soul together, and when we need a job, I don't minimize that. But I think we can be encouraged to be too instrumental about it. I thought the question you were asking is, what do we do when we're confronted with somebody who doesn't understand and is fully locked into a rather left hemispheric point of view? But that wasn't your question.
No, it's more about myself. What if I'm that person, right? I myself am the person who's locked in.
Oh,
Yeah,
you
there
think?
you go. Well, no, I mean, yeah, what should my posture be in front of life's questions? Yeah. Or
If you were, you wouldn't have turned up today.
Mari and then Leo.
I was wondering if you could speak more about the relationship between sadness and art, or sadness in art.
Okay.
I really liked
Yes.
your mention of kind of the slightly melancholy lament in music, and why maybe it's especially effective as a
Yes.
mediator for something.
Yes.
And I've been looking at the painting of Ophelia a
Yes.
lot this week, and it's spectacular. So maybe it has to do with your talk on the coincidence of opposites,
Right.
that there's harmony in the relationships themselves, but then there's fragmentation in the sadness.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, I suppose it's quite a theme, really, isn't it, in the matter, not the master with the master in his emissary. And really, I begin to talk about that mainly in the chapter on the Renaissance, because at that moment there is a rise of references to melancholy, and we talked about this. I don't know why it is, this unexpected melancholy that you can't really say where it comes from. And you see it in The Merchant of Venice, and you see it in Hamlet, and so on. And what I think is happening is that there is a resonance with the deep empathic part of the right hemisphere. So we know that sadness is a tendency more of the right frontal pole of the brain, and a kind of elation, if unchecked, in the left frontal lobe of the brain. One of the reasons that it is possible to be elated is if you are basically withdrawn altogether from contact with the world, which the left hemisphere is fully capable of. But melancholy is about feeling for the suffering of humanity, feeling empathy for others. And what's particularly interesting in the Renaissance is mixed emotions. So the idea of a sweet melancholy, the idea of something that is not wholly negative in the melancholy, that indeed it is revelatory of something. And I think I'm right in saying that this happened fairly late on in Roman history. David will correct me, but Methodorus has something to say about this, about mixed emotions. And this is a rather sophisticated idea, typical of the ability of the right hemisphere to see the broad picture and not just close down into an emotion. And although I'm simplifying here, it is, broadly speaking, the left hemisphere that gives us anger, scorn, narcissistic superiority, hubris, and the right hemisphere, which enables us to feel a slightly more humble awareness of what it is we don't know, a connection to, as I say, suffering humanity, and to the feeling of the world at large, a sort of Weltschmerz that was, that's to move forward far too far in time, but it's the beginnings of something like that. And you see it come back, of course, in Romanticism, where I believe after the Enlightenment, which is obviously a swing towards the left hemisphere's position, a very beneficial one in many ways, and if I'd been alive at the time, I would have been a great enthusiast for it. I'm only a partial enthusiast for it because I see where it has led, which is to a completely overreaching ambition and a kind of hubris which is going to destroy us. But the Romantics, it's an unfortunate name, Romanticism, because it has connotations of lack of rigor and dreaminess. But in fact, the philosophers that are associated with the rise of Romanticism, people like Schelling and Hegel, are amongst the most sophisticated philosophers the West has ever seen. And so, and their view of the world was complex and was able to take into account the elements such as intuition and feeling and so on, not just the workings of the intellect, but not devoid, after all, of the workings of the intellect. So my tutor, not really my tutor, that's the wrong word, my mentor in my medical education was somebody who's called the father of neuropsychiatry, Alwyn Lichtman. He was a delightful man, and since we're talking about that kind of thing, a remarkably modest man. And he was a great musician. It's quite amusing that he wrote a book called Organic Psychiatry, which is pretty much the Bible on the relationship between the brain and psyche. But he was also a great organist, and he enjoyed music very much. And I remember him saying to me, and I think I footnote that this was an insight of his, he said, you know, in essence, music is always a bit sad. And I hadn't really thought about it, but largely speaking, I think that's immediately intuitively true. And of course there is music that is joyful and so on, but I say something like that is the sort of course you don't have the term bank holiday, but the bank holiday of melancholy. There is the time off from melancholy where one's allowed for a moment to be elated. But all the deep stuff is not from elation. The deep stuff is from the contacting of melancholy, which puts us in the realm of the spirit again. There's a very close relationship between the soberness of reflection, of melancholy, of silence, of deep thought, and creativity. So I believe he's right. And a friend of mine came to stay with me in Scotland. I was playing some music by a band who are a sort of Celtic fusion band. They're remarkably good, but anyway, there they are. And some of their music is very lively indeed. You can hardly listen to it without wanting to dance. And he said, yes, but you know, it's all tinged with melancholy. And he's absolutely right. If you listen to Scottish music, listen to Irish music, if you listen to music, full stop, you're aware that the stuff that's speaking to you is speaking to you in a voice that we don't have the right words for. We can only say has something of melancholy or sadness about it. Thank you.
I think Leo had a question, and then Eamon.
As you were responding to Mari's question, I heard you mention Hegel, and what's jumped to mind is section 40 of the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, where he defines dogmatism as the erroneous reduction of philosophical truth to linguistic propositions of a mathematical sort. And obviously you've developed this claim in throughout your work, and especially in the third chapter of The Master and His Emissary, you suggest that we too often equate thinking and language, when in truth there exist complementary modes of apprehension that both precede and transcend words. And intuition and imagination obviously are two such modes of apprehension, but it seems to me that they're often presented as in the context of an individual's solipsistic encounter with the world, being Einstein, Blake, or whoever it may be. As such, I was hoping you could say more about intuition and imagination as they unfold between human beings. What, if anything, do dialogical relationships between human selves afford that an individual's solo encounter with the world doesn't? And if I may, what specific embodied experiences should we foster in order to allow ourselves to experience intuition and imagination between one another, in order to allow ourselves to, I suppose, fall again in love with being through each other?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. First of all, intuition and imagination are themselves an encounter. They are themselves an encounter with reality. And so there need be no third party involved, because there is an I-thou relationship already with whatever the other is. But you're quite right to say that well, first of all, that humans need encounters with other human beings to be in any sense fulfilled, and that such encounters also enrich our understanding of the world, and they can't be substituted by simple knowledge of something that has no character, no personality, no embodiment. Of course, some writing does have character, personality, and embodiment. And one thing that pleases me is that people sometimes say, in reading you, I feel like I get to know you. And I hope that's right, without sacrificing necessary objectivity, whatever that may be. So, and we can come back to that if you want. But I think a lot of things have come to me, and I make this point about education, not just through books, although there have been a hell of a lot of those, but from encounters with people, and people who particularly made an impression on me early in my life. So there have been people, the relationship with whom have completely changed without me being able to say exactly what it is that they've changed. And sometimes I would like to write a book just to honor those people and say something about them. So those encounters are profound. And of course, anyone who has been in love knows that this is also a transformative experience, and that without it, there are aspects of reality that you're not aware of. So I think being able to feel into another person's life, often referred to in a rather reductive idea of, the idea that you're sort of just cognitively entering into them. But there is another kind which is emotionally entering into what they are experiencing. And we do that intuitively a great deal of the time. So we don't really need to exercise techniques unless we're having trouble with being empathic, which some people do. And I'm not sure I have exercises to suggest, but I think that ways of doing this include it's very banal, but being able to exercise mindfulness. I know it's a very trendy thing to talk about, but it is very rich. And in the Metaphysical, in a quite late chapter, probably I think it's in one of the appendices actually. But anyway, I quote from an acknowledged Rinpoche who is the master of mindfulness. And I quote a passage, it's not very long, it's the length of about 2 paragraphs, in which I number 23 things that he says in there, which show the right hemisphere correlates of what he's talking about. And he's talking about stilling the speaking mind, opening oneself into a sort of attentive receptivity. In fact, I call it active receptivity. So it's not just passive receptivity, like just but also listening intently for something that is speaking to you. So that enables you to open up to something that is communicating to you and stops everything being blocked out by the ideas and thoughts that you already have, which tend to represent conceptions in the left hemisphere. So transcending that is what we have, going beyond mindfulness, what we have religious ritual for, what we have myths for, narratives, poetry, music, fables, and humor, as well as poetry. So all of these things, and I love the fact that in Zen, humor is very important. So all of these things help to take us beyond our sort of enclosed self to a relationship with others, an awareness of something beyond. I think that's really all I can say, except that exactly the kind of education that is going on here is the kind that does that in 2 very obvious ways. You are a community, and I see that a lot comes from the fact that you are a community, that you're not just sitting across the United States or perhaps around the world in front of a computer listening to talks, but you're actually together and talking to one another, and occasionally talking to me, for which I'm very grateful. So there's that. And there's also the fact that the kind of learning you're getting is about people in the past talking and talking to one another. Indeed, David Butterfield's lecture had a lot about exactly that, about learning how to speak rhetoric and the ability to see more than one side to a case. And if we had more of that in the world, it would be a happier place to live in. Thank you.
Ian, may I ask a quick follow-up
Yes.
to that question? And that is, one of the primary ways in which we open ourselves up, as you so beautifully were putting it, is simply to pull back from the immediate stream of things to do and notifications on the devices and all of the constant inputs and flurry of messages and activity and is it the case, do you think, that we're at a time in history in which we just don't have solitude, the kind of quiet with the self that is the necessary kind of condition? I mean, the very most basic, we're talking about how do you connect with people. I mean, well, sometimes you need to think about them and not simply engage, but to step back for a few minutes. Even, I mean, it's a kind of very humbling thing for me personally to say. I mean, how much time do you spend thinking about the people who are most important in your life? I mean, really, and I don't mean just, okay, what do I do today and the next day, but taking 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, and actually to really devote spiritual and intellectual energies to try to best, understand in the fullness what that person is and what your relation to that person, best can be. And so the question I have, Ian, is do you think that in addition to, and sometimes mediated by, myth and religious ritual and so on, that simply having time to step back is fundamental to gaining or regaining a sense of the whole?
That was a question begging the answer yes.
I'm sorry about that.
No, quite right. But I willingly give you 100% yes as a response. You've put your finger on something terrifically important. We always think that creativity is to do with action, but a lot of the time it's to do with inaction, but not in a passive way, as I'm saying. And for that, you need silence and a degree of aloneness. So, where have I said this before? It's not either or, but it's both and. You need connectivity, but you need also space of your own. And we have no places in the modern world that provide silence and peace without isolation. It's very difficult to find that. And in a city, it's particularly hard to find it. But I do believe profoundly that stillness and silence are, as it were, the foundation for creativity, for empathy. And the answer to the thing about, do we have time when we think about others and so forth is, I mean, in a way, that's what prayer is about, partly. It's not only or mainly perhaps petitionary prayer. And indeed, St. Francis said, when you pray, you must pray for nothing. You must bless. And I think that is what I believe. Again, I've gone through changes during my lifetime to think that petitionary prayer was perhaps the main part of prayer, but I think it's now an add-on occasionally to thanksgiving and adoration.
And may I ask just a quick follow-up about that, Ian? You touched on the widespread view that we should just be active and go get things done. And yet, if you look at the most creative and thus, in a certain sense, productive people, it was in withdrawal or non-instrumental periods of non-instrumental reflection that turned out to be most generative. And we've been spending some time with the Neoplatonists, and certainly Plotinus and others are brilliant expositors of this, but it's so counterintuitive in our current moment. I'm wondering if you would, if you can tell us more about why it is that silence and withdrawal, paradoxically, are in fact more generative, or in a sense fundamental to what is most generative, than just being task-oriented to try to achieve something?
I think it's one of the great errors of our age is to believe that people should always be being obviously productive. And one of the reasons that silence and slow time is generative is that for the first time, it stops the immediate jumping to conclusions. It stops the immediate left hemisphere, oh, I know this, I know the answer to this. And you've really got to stave off that long enough for an idea to flourish before you start closing it down. So in a soundbite, the right hemisphere opens up to possibility, the left hemisphere closes down to certainty. And you need to stop the left hemisphere closing down to certainty for long enough to think for things to build. And mainly you have to have, I think always actually, you have to have some peace. And that it's very well known that these moments when the mind is not on a determined task are essential to creativity. You know the various stories about people whose insights came in moments when they weren't thinking about the issue at all. I mean, this is obviously the most generative time of all. And Edison had this thing, of sitting in a chair and going to sleep with some ball bearings in his hand over a basin. And when he began to fall asleep, the balls would drop and wake him up. And it was during that moment between sleep and wakefulness when the ideas came. So, see, the thing is that you shoot yourself in the foot if you think, well, we'll be super effective if we drive everybody to a certain target. No, what you'll become is reliably mediocre. This way of over-controlling has only one outcome, which is mediocrity. It cannot possibly reach greatness. Greatness is reached by people who have a great deal of time that is fallow and seems maybe at the time to be wasted time, but is not. And, going back to the 60s, I think I'm right in saying the Rand Corporation used to take on people who were obviously bright, and they give them a desk and an office and say, fais ce que vous voudras, do what you want. And the idea there, I think, was very successful because a lot of brilliant ideas came out of the 60s. It's been commented by historians of science that since then there have been fewer breakthroughs than there were in the 50 years running up to that, vastly fewer in science. There have been mainly elaborations into technology of ideas that were already generated, but there haven't been paradigm shifts. And for those paradigm shifts to come about, you need special people in special circumstances.
Thank you. Next questions. I think we had Eamon, and who else have I got? I've got Eric, Olivia. Please make sure I don't not see your hand. If you've got a question, make sure you make yourself known. Okay, Eamon next.
I was very interested into your knowledge into the fact that consciousness may very well not be located in the actual hemispherical structures of our brain. And I was also interested in Dr. Bryson's proposition of a certain stability in a metaphysical heaven that we conceptualize as like a stable heaven. And I think the two might be related in some way. And there's a Cappadocian church father, St. Gregory of Nyssa, who talks about the perfection of the human soul being in the continued perfecting of itself, even in death. And the mutability that is sometimes sought to be done away with in the body in a Platonic tradition is in fact encouraged by St. Gregory to be utilized in the process of this perfection, to be held up rather than the job of the soul being to hold up the mutability, to have that change generate the perfection. So I was wondering, given that consciousness may not exist in the brain, if the right and the left hemisphere, the relationship between them might go past death and be such a fundamental relationship that it doesn't have hemispherical location as much as, be interwoven into the very fabric of life itself, the relationship between the two.
Well, thank you. But first of all, I don't say that consciousness is not in the brain. I just say that it doesn't come from the brain. it has an origin beyond the brain. But clearly the brain is very important, otherwise I wouldn't have wasted 30 years studying it. So I'm a great believer in the brain, and I don't think I'd be giving this talk well without it. So, but I'm glad you mentioned Gregory of Nyssa, who is a person I have profound respect for. And once again, one finds that these mystics who really have deep insights that the mainstream of theology finds difficult to accommodate, and either ignores or reduces to propositions that don't really do full justice to what he's saying. What I would say is that, yes, I think that consciousness obviously is available and may continue beyond our brains. That's what I believe. But for the while we're here, it does something that enables consciousness to take part in the process of the cosmos. So a lot of theologians are upset because they think I'm putting forward a process view of God. And they're right, I am. But I don't deny that it is perfectly possible in the case of God, because we can't lay down rules about what God may or may not be. But it seems to me a kind of wisdom that's already present in the idea of the Trinity and in the idea of other religious traditions, that there is a processual divine that is in the world, and there is also one that is above everything. There is Atman that is in each of you, but there is Brahman, in which the all resides, which is the undifferentiated divine. And I would say that the structure of the brain is necessarily the way it is because there is an element in reality that it has to engage with. And, I once said when I was on a panel with Rowan Williams, and I may have said this before, but I'll say it again, I said, I don't really know whether the cosmos looks the way it does because our brain is shaped like this, or our brain is shaped like this because the cosmos is the way it is and it needs to be engaged with it. And he said, does it have to be either one or the other? Which was completely touché. And it doesn't, of course. And there is, as always, there is an encounter in which each takes part.
I think Eric had a question.
There's an idea that was introduced into the Western mind by Carl Jung, and he termed it synchronicity, and he opposed it to causality. It's essentially a way of ordering a way that the universe is ordered, which is not causal but acausal. And I know that he got it from Eastern traditions, from Taoism, especially the divination techniques of the I Ching. I know that these experiences, coincidental experiences, synchronous experiences, are perceived by people. That there's some research that shows that they are perceived by people when they're in a more emotionally labile state, when they have more a death perhaps, or a spiritual experience, something like this happens, and that they'll experience these synchronous states with more frequency. I'm curious about the relationship between heightened or diminished emotionality and our perception of the world, and especially of these seemingly coincidental experiences, if you have anything to say about that.
Thank you, yes. I may not be able to address that very well. Yes, I think what we're talking about here is situations in which for a while, the authoritarian hand of the left hemisphere is loosened and enables us to see things that otherwise we wouldn't see. So rather than necessarily talking about heightened emotional states, although that certainly could be the case, it's more, I would say, occasions in which we have through accident or through purposeful attempts to do so, achieved a kind of temporary consciousness in which things that we say to ourselves that cannot be, we accept. Now, there are dangers to that, of course. And in a way, science is caught between the Scylla and Charybdis of over-rigidity and over-fluidity. So if you move to accept things, everything that comes along that seems not to fit the current paradigm, you have no workable scientific framework. On the other hand, if that framework is not able to accept at times things that are officially not possible in that framework, it will never make new discoveries. And so I think that, I mean, this takes me to another area in a way, and I'll try to show you how this is relevant. The limits to our senses. See, we have limits to our senses because they will only hear in a certain range of frequencies. We only see certain things. But I've strongly believed that when people who've not been westernized and still live very close to nature say that they can hear things, that the forest speaks to them, that they can hear somebody a couple of 100 miles away, that they can hear voices of ancestors, who am I to deny that this may be possible? It doesn't fit into the way we see things, but maybe that's because we have rigorously denied the possibility from an early age. And I won't repeat this because I think I've said it at least once, that the evidence is that children are not, as Dawkins thinks, trained and educated into believing a lot of daft things like religion, but in fact start with those intuitions very strongly, and if anything, education knocks it out of them. So it's the exact opposite of what Dawkins believes. And so children are told when they hear things or see things that their parents don't. They say, well, no, don't be silly. There's nobody really there, and, you know, you mustn't tell fibs and this kind of thing. But actually, there may be something there that, as long as you disattend to it, you will never see it. So in those states in which one has been able to loosen the grip of the left hemisphere, you may be aware of these synchronicities. I mean, you may also be over-aware. You may kind of invent coincidences, as it were, where there's nothing really significant. But I think I've had a few instances where it's hard to say that they weren't, and certainly Jung thought that was the case. I would think that Jung was perfectly happy with the idea that there is causation, but that there are also, if you like, form fields, gestalten, that cohere, that make sense, but don't follow a linear cause and effect. And it's very much my way of thinking that, I mean, I was going to include in my book a diagram, but for copyright reasons I wasn't allowed to, that was of the Afghan war presented to General McGhilchrist by a firm in London that had been asked to do logistics. And you only have to see it to burst out laughing. It's a hilarious map with arrows in different colors going all over the map. And when it was presented to General McGhilchrist, he dryly remarked, "When we have understood that, we will have won the war." Correct. But if you look at it in detail, and you just go to a tiny place, you can see a chain of arrows. And so the chain of arrows truly is cause and effect. But the overall picture cannot be summed up in that way because it's not a complicated system, it's a complex system. And complex systems have recursive loops. They allow things to emerge that come from holes that we cannot predict, not just because we don't see enough and don't understand enough, but because they are intrinsically unpredictable. So I think I certainly would, accept the important validity of cause and effect, but also things that at times you would be blind to unless you're able to see that certain clusters of things attract other things that move with them. And, I think making reflections on physics, if you're not a physicist, is probably a recipe for making a fool of yourself. But there are physicists, I certainly know, who suggest that the fact that particles can be entangled and so on means that there are relations between things that persist after an event that are not accounted for in our normal way of thinking. Thank you.
The comment you've spurred, and I think your comments about children and their perceptions the perceptions they begin with has brought me to a kind of recollection and realization, and that is simply this, that children are capable, and perhaps all of them do, ask questions of adults in their lives, that the adults, it's kind of hilarious actually, that the adults are within one or two questions totally unable to answer, right? Because they're asking about, why the stars are like this, or, they're childlike. What I'm trying to suggest is that those childlike questions are perhaps, that we find ourselves very much struggling to answer, are perhaps a sign of precisely the kinds of intuitions that children have, that we have a hard time hanging on to, but which the deep questions that we come consciously to ask take us back in some sense too.
The important thing with deep questions is not to let the question go. It's not to have to answer it, but never to let go of that question. And, it's often said that a fool may ask a question a wise man cannot answer, but it's still worth bearing in mind if you can't answer it. So, yeah, I like that.
All right, I think Olivia had a question, am I right?
Thank you. This is actually perhaps related to the question of children and also staying with questions. And something that I've been greatly troubled over, and also a question that I've been sticking with, is that of marriage and divorce. And I wonder if we can get greater insight on the disillusion of this fundamental institutional unit through the lens of hemispheric disharmony. But also, the question on my mind is, how can we proceed with a harmonious, approach to the world, to our goals, like your response to her question, not to be so fixed and say, oh, I want to get married and have kids. This is what I'm going to do. And yet we seem to be facing this loss of our fundamental symbol for the unity of the soul that seems to be this unity between men and women. And we've especially seen that in The Tempest and in Hamlet. And I think maybe Goethe would lament, we've become incredibly good at dividing the united. And you see that in the divorce rates, at least for us Americans. 50% of first marriages don't work out. And then with second and third, it's even higher.
Yes.
And how do we unite the divided and proceed in light of this crisis?
Yes. Well, thank you. It's a big societal problem, and it has many causes, I suppose, and it's hard to know where to start, but it seems to me that problem is a central one because it has eroded structures in society, and I speak this with a mea culpa because I'm a man who's been twice divorced. Once I accepted it, and once I absolutely didn't, but had to. And I think what can happen is that I think we need stability of the idea of the male and female, and that's being attacked much more radically now in a way which is a deliberate assault on nature. I believe that we face a deliberate assault on nature and on our bodies. I think this is part of the general hubristic idea that we can be and do anything we like without taking any cognizance of our nature and how things are generally created. What we've got is a situation in which, in many cases, the exception has become more prominent than the norm. So the fact that most people don't consider wanting to change sex has somehow been turned around by people who have been, in many cases, persuaded and then regretted to follow this path. And there's nothing wrong with people doing this. I myself have looked after 2 patients who were, in the era before the various hysterics about this were in the public sphere, were doing this, and I hope I was able to help them. So, but it's a marginal thing, and it shouldn't become the center. That's the problem. In the place of some stability, there is now only chaos, and this must be enormously difficult for children growing up. Coming back to marriage, thinking there was a golden age when marriages were were brilliant is probably wrong, because there were always marriages that were very unhappy, and those marriages arguably weren't to anyone's benefit when they continued, that they led to anger, violence, and not a happy atmosphere for children to grow up in. So I think there are cases in which it is actually better that the marriage should be dissolved. But I don't think it should be taken as a light step, and I don't think it should be, it's a tragedy that 50% of marriages do this. And if I had to point to one thing, I think, again, it's the overemphasis on the idea that you can be and have everything you want. I mean, this is just so wrong. It's a sentimentality that actually harms those that it's supposed to cosset. So it's a very important idea that, no, we have limitations. Humanity has limitations to do with being human and to do with nature, and those limitations are good. They are productive. They are how we are, and that to do away with them will not make us more productive and happier. In fact, it's manifestly making us unhappier. I mean, it's not my opinion. It is measurable that there is enormously more mental illness and unhappiness than there was in the past. So I think the problem there is the expectation that each person can simply do what they want without any sense of sharing or compromise. And a good marriage is, to a large extent, I believe, a matter of making the appropriate compromises. And the happiest marriages I have seen have been in the generation of those who are now dying out. I know a lot of extremely happy marriages that went to the end because both parties were not caught up into a fantasy that they could do what they wanted. They wanted to be together, and they recognized rationally and emotionally that this was a matter of a relationship, not a matter of me, me, me. And we live in that, I mean, it's a truism that we live in an era in which I am most important. Well, we have to replace that with no. It's not as simple as that. You emerge from and are part of nature and part of the society that made you who you are. And it is your job while you are here to honor nature and to honor that society and to hope to give back. So it is always a dance. Life is a dance, not a matter of equations. And a dance involves relationships, or it did do until very, very recently, in which it's also become a solipsistic exercise. But there's nothing more beautiful than being caught up in a dance of the kind where you are sharing with a group of people. And I was going to write a book at some stage called, Life's a Dance. And we don't appreciate that. Our marriages and our relationships are. They're a watching of the steps of the other and reciprocating and so on. And when it goes well, it's exhilarating and beautiful. But in such a dance, it's no good stamping your foot and standing still and frowning and saying, well, if you don't do the steps I want you to do, I'm walking off the dance floor. So those are my very, very simple-minded reflections on that. But I think that society needs to return to a sense of what a human individual is. And that's why I wrote The Matter with Things. I begin with this quotation, from Plotinus, who are we? Tinis hermais. And I think that's really so important. We don't ask that question. We assume. We assume we're machines. We assume we're isolated bodies. We assume that our primal goal is being out for ourselves. But it isn't. And it's not even true of the history of evolution that it is exclusively about competition. It is at least as much about cooperation, and probably more. And the two put together make collaboration. And collaborative evolution is how species have excelled and thrived. And it's true in societies that those who are able to cooperate with others as well as compete with them. I'm not somebody who believes that everything competitive should be done away with. A lot of greatness comes out of it. But it's not the whole story. Once again, it's not either or, it's both and.
May I ask you, and you've written so beautifully about the nature of reality being relational, and here in response to Olivia's question, you can think that you're not a relational being, but that doesn't change the fact that you are a relational being. And so, You can live in dynamic and rich reciprocity and self-giving and so on with others in some kind of harmony, perhaps often maybe at times difficult. There's discord that is worked into that harmony, and we all know this from all of our actual relationships, but they can be harmonious and good and beautiful. You can also transgress those or try and opt out of those, but it's not as if you're able to just turn down your relationality to zero and become something else. No, you're lonely and alienated and frustrated and so on. So it's not as if it's not optional whether we're relational beings. And I'm wondering if you would say something about what you think would be involved in our, as it were, reweaving the fabric of a culture that enables the actualization of our relationality in various levels and contexts, all the way from the bottom to the top, so to speak, in in the various layers and levels, both sideways and up and down in human culture. And so a question about how one reestablishes the context, whether they're practices, rituals, philosophical, theological, psychological understandings, all of these things that are at work in our having places for human beings to live and flourish.
Well, we're all miserably isolated. I say all because obviously not all of us in this room are, but as a society we are. And so we start from the standpoint of what I alone experience, what I alone know, what I alone want. And that's a function of many things. The mere size of societies, their centripetal movements, and the breakdown of the customs and rituals and codes of practice that used to hold people together. We need somehow to generate trust, and I think that's a very difficult thing to do, because trust is one of those things that once lost is almost not quite impossible, but enormously hard work to get back. So we should value trust above all other things. I quote whatever his name is, the Emperor Chong Tzu, who said that in a society you need weapons, food, and trust. And if you have to give up one, give up the weapons. If you have to give up two, give up the food, because without trust we cannot survive. So without trust, we're nowhere. And trust is an incredibly economic way of living, which enables us to do away with laws, not wholly, of course, but to do without enormously elaborate legal and administrative structures such as we have now. So we're paying the price for that. But how do we regenerate? I haven't the answer to this, but maybe you have. How do we regenerate trust in a society that is atomized and is also composed of people from very different traditions and parts of the world who don't have the same intuitions about how people behave?
Well, I'll only say that one of the fundamental purpose of Ralston College, and we'll see what becomes of our efforts here, but it is both to recover a deep sense of what the human being is in relation to the whole that is the world out there, reality broadly conceived, but also to try to create a community in which that conception can be realized. And my highest hope is that our students, as you know, they're living together, mostly living together, and all of them are spending a lot of time with each other. And it's very moving to me to see, after only 7 months or whatever it is, that you know each other, and in so many ways you love each other. You've become something as a group that was not conscripted or required or forced upon you, but freely self-developed over the course of experiences together and living together and traveling and moving and reading and thinking and eating and dining and so on together. And I suppose it's my hope is that this experience, which you yourselves have brought into being, it's true we tried to set the conditions for that to happen, and we spent a lot of time and intention in doing that. But my hope is that, and I don't pretend as if, of course, you came here with no idea about anything in human life and now you've just got it. Nothing of the sort. Of course, you're all highly intelligent and thoughtful and people with your own rich and intricate histories. But my hope is that this experience of a kind of community is also one that enables you to build and develop human relationships that are harmonious and rich in your own personal lives, in your families, in your friends, but also in your communities, states, wherever you go on to live. Because I think without that, I think it's that kind of experience that enables us to rebuild.
Yes, so one thing that follows in my mind from that is that the way you repopulate anything is to begin with little foci, little centres where this happens, and hope that they'll spread outwards and at times share with one another until it becomes more general. I don't know where I've got this idea from, but somebody authoritative sounding, suggested that if we got about 3 to 5% of the population to think in a certain way, it would cause a shift. I think you can see this in the past, that quite small groups of people ended up wielding a very great deal of power, for better or worse, actually. So maybe one of the things we need to do is, as I hope, is to accelerate what your project here, your brilliant brainchild here is doing, and to see more of these centres like Ralston, if anything can be like Ralston, coming into being.
Hear, hear. I'm just going to ask if there are any other questions on the floor. We do have another few minutes, but we can also conclude now if there are not. Jake.
We definitely got some time. Yeah.
Pardon me.
Thank you. I'm still very curious about embodiment and maybe the difference between something like disembodied contemplation and embodied attention. It seems like there's something in the schizophrenic and the autist that spends too much time in the disembodied contemplative. Sometimes I worry that all this time in the realm of ideas puts me at risk of a right brain deficit. And I'm curious what you would say about balancing, coming back into balance with the body.
Well, yes, I do think that. I mean, it is interesting that, as I point out, ducking for shelter, as I do so in the matter with things, quite a lot of influential people in the Anglo-American analytic tradition have been quite clearly on the autistic spectrum. And they exemplify, to my mind, a certain way of thinking that certainly has its value, but is not broad enough or rich enough to be able to sustain a true search for wisdom rather than simply the following out of the logical consequences of adopting certain premises and a certain way of thinking. So yes, embodiment, I would like to say, it has now become a much more fashionable thing in philosophy. So people are talking much more about embodied cognition. However, they're still imaging it in a very computer-like way. And if I may just point out that computers don't have body and they don't have blood flowing through their chips. So there's something going on that is moving, is seeing that there's something missing. But embodiment is what almost effortlessly comes through the embrace of the things I was saying that go beyond the mere explicit intellect. And so music is one of the very most obvious ones that is not encompassable by science or reason, but is nonetheless very, very real and very, very powerful. And its power comes from a kind of embodiment. And even if, certain people with autism are very, very good at expressing this expressing through music their embodiment. So it may be a complex thing, not that they have no sense of that, but that expressing it is often difficult. The obvious example is Glenn Gould, who, if you watch him playing, it's absolutely extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, the man crouching over the keyboard and sort of doing these mysterious movements. It's absolutely not like hearing a computer churn something out. And the music is absolutely vibrant. And part of the beauty of it is that it plays with being rather detached. So at least his 1955 version of the Goldbergs, when he was young, was a virtuoso performance at extraordinarily high speed. And it's exhilarating, and it doesn't feel like you're hearing a mechanism. You know there is a person that's sort of being carried away by this. But the 72 or whatever it was, no, it must be later than, no, I think, well, anyway. His later Goldbergs were, I think, more beautiful and more profound, and not quite so show-offy, but they both have their virtues, and I love listening to either. So really that's just that was a digression on music, but music is fully embodied, but so is poetry, you see, and that's why I wrote what I did in my 20s about the problems with literary criticism, that it failed to recognize that this was a product of an embodied being that was itself an embodiment of something and spoke to an embodied being, the reader. And that if we didn't see that, we hadn't understood the poem, which is why I believe that the most powerful criticism of a poem, in one sense, is to read it aloud. So reading it aloud allows you to understand it more fully. Even hearing it read aloud, if it's done well, helps you to understand it more fully. And that's because you are more taken up in the non-cognitive aspects of the poem. So when you read a poem, your autonomic nervous system is reacting and can bring tears to your eyes. It can make the hair on your neck stand up. But also in quite simple things like blood pressure, pulse, breathing, and even contractions and relaxations in skeletal muscle in response to the movement of the verse, although one may not be aware of any of these things. So it is an embodied being, and stripping it of its embodiment is to neutralize it. And ultimately, the best way to do that is to just paraphrase a poem. Paraphrase a poem, and you've just killed a living thing.
Other questions? Yes, all right. Ari and then Petra.
I think you mentioned in your Sophia lectures, one of the lectures that you gave last week, you just talked briefly about creativity and how it's a new idea, like it's entirely original. And you said something like that. And it just prompted a lot of thoughts about creativity, which I know didn't really exist as a word. I mean, it's kind of a modern concept, I guess, the idea of creativity. But just the idea, is it possible to do anything that's entirely original? Or is every idea we have influenced somehow by the interactions that we have with the past and other people? And so I guess I'm just curious, like, what is creativity? And is it possible to be entirely original? That seems like an extremely high standard, and that maybe I've never achieved that. Like everything I've ever thought has been thought before.
Well, as always, it's not all or nothing. So there is no way in which you can be original without respect to a tradition, even if your task is to rebuff that tradition. That is an idea that comes out of the tradition that we now have, that it's okay to do that. And being original is important, but we live in an age in which it's over-adulated, so that almost everything great has its everything great has its forebears. It doesn't arise ex nihilo. So, on the other hand, when you come to somebody like Shakespeare, although you can point, and indeed yesterday we had some learned commentary on the way in which Shakespeare learnt from Roman comedy and so forth, the fact is that he's the nearest example of doing things that had not been done before. To that extent, he was original. But of course, he was deeply steeped in the culture, the Elizabethan culture, that produced other, perhaps lesser, but nonetheless highly creative and generative poets. I mean, in some senses, you can say that everything is creative, or you can say that nothing is. I mean, it depends how you define it. If you define creativity very narrowly, that it's got to be entirely original, there is no creativity. I always say a tradition is not a way of fossilizing things, but a way of allowing them to make progress, that without a tradition, you cannot have the flow that we have. Every great writer has come out of a tradition and contributed to that tradition in turn. And T.S. Eliot even suggested that in the light of something later in the tradition, things that were earlier in the tradition have been altered because we see something that developed from them. And so when we go back to read them, we read them with the knowledge of where they were going. And that's an interesting thought. But what it is suggesting is that tradition is a flow. it's not a fossilization as it's now supposed to be. It is a flow. And I can't remember who it was said, everything flows. Yes, of course I can. But, I always come back to everything flows because the philosophy of flow seems to me to answer so many problems we have, from making things discontinuous, fragmenting them, putting them in boxes. And if we see the way in which things lead in a beautifully created way from one to another, then we're released from this tyranny that we've got to be suddenly completely original. I mean, I think only a fool would try to do that. And there are quite a lot of fools around who fail as a result. But so that's my main response. I think the good metaphor is that of a garden. So a gardener cannot make a plant. A gardener cannot even make a plant flourish. It can give the circumstances in which a plant can flourish. And that's what the gardener does. And if the gardener says, I don't like this plant being there, I want it to go up the wall, but over there, and hurries the process by cutting it off and sticking it on the wall over there, it's just completely destroyed the plant. So it has to be it's an organism. It needs to be tended to and seduced to go in a certain way. But creativity is a big topic, and I do have a whole chapter on it in The Matter with Things. But I don't really want to rehash all that. No. Thank you very much.
I think we're going to conclude this very vibrant discussion with Dr. McGhilchrist. Please join me in giving him a warm thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Ralston College podcast. Today's episode featured a conversation between Dr. Iain McGilchrist and students enrolled in our MA in the Humanities program, recorded during his visit to our Savannah campus in March of 2024 to deliver the college's annual Sophia Lectures. Our fully funded MA in the Humanities program is currently accepting applications for next academic year, by which I mean beginning this August of 2025. This one-year adventure of a lifetime begins in Greece on the island of Samos with an intensive Greek course so you can encounter the ancients face to face in their own language, and then continues here in beautiful Savannah with a rich, multidisciplinary approach to the perennial questions of human life and in a community defined by freedom of thought and friendship. You can apply and learn more on our website at www.ralston.ac. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Till next time.